Special thanks to the K Family Foundation, lead underwriters for MOSAIC. Hello, my name is Barbara Kay, and on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, I'd like to welcome you to our program, MOSAIC. Our special guest on MOSAIC today is the Managing Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Michael Singh. We'll be back with our guest and our program right after this brief message.
Thanks to your support, Federation maintains the fabric of the Jewish community. By enabling our community to remain vital and vibrant today and for future generations.
Mentoring more than 400 at-risk children through the Youth Futures program in Federation's partnered communities of Israel's Tzachar region.
Providing a wealth of social, welfare, spiritual and educational services available to the 110,000 members of the Jewish community in St. Petersburg, Russia.
We touch so many and do so much. Your dollars fund the work of our Federation. Thank you for your generous support.
Welcome back to MOSAIC. It's a pleasure to have you here,
Good to see you,
Michael
Barbara.
Singh. Really, you brighten up the whole day. Listen, we have to talk about some pretty heavy subjects, but first, I think it would be interesting for our viewers to understand really what the mission of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy is.
Well, thanks, Barbara, and it's great to be here. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute in Washington, D.C., and we have a whole stable of scholars who focus just on the Middle East. And what they do is they provide analysis and policy recommendations to the U.S. government and to other governments about essentially how to advance sensible policy and how to advance U.S. interests in the Middle East. And so that can cover things like Iran's nuclear program, it can cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and these days we've been doing a lot of work on places like Egypt and Libya and Tunisia and Yemen, you name it, essentially providing surge capacity in a way to the U.S. government because there are so many crises and so many problems in the Middle East right now. And we have this very deep roster of expertise that can help the U.S. government to cope with this unprecedented series of crises at this moment.
Yeah, you've become a resource for the government, literally, which is very prestigious, I must say. Speaking of everything that's going on, I mean, it's a mosaic or chaotic mosaic, if you will, if you let me use that term, in the Middle East. And the spring is, I think, becoming a little bit of a fall. Would you mind telling me the implications vis-a-vis Israel and also the rest of the world?
Of course. Well, it is a very challenging moment right now. It's a turning point, I think, in the Middle East. And as we look back historically, I think we'll see it as that, a pivotal point in the history of this region. And it's a time where I think we shouldn't be totally pessimistic. I think there is reason for hope that these countries will take a positive path and turn into something which is better for both the United States, Israel, and the entire world. But of course, there are real threats as well. And we've seen the rise of Islamists across the region. We've seen Iran trying to exploit what's been happening in these Arab countries. And so it's really a very dicey moment right now. I think what we'll see in the near term is that these revolutions will really continue. You know, revolutions rarely are just 1 week or 1 month affairs. Normally there's a first phase, a second phase, and so forth. And I think that whoever is able to provide some economic growth, for example, whoever is able to provide political stability will be the ones in these countries, Egypt, Libya, and elsewhere, that ends up on top throughout this tumult. But I think it will be a while before we get there. And so what does that mean for Israel, for the United States? I think it means just a more dangerous short term, essentially. As different parties jockey for position, they might use anti-Americanism, they might use anti-Israel rhetoric in an effort to build up their own domestic standing. And I think that we'll also see in this time an increased risk of conflict, because as these states try to redefine their positions in the Middle East, they may find themselves increasingly at odds with one another.
You know something, it's interesting because from a cultural point of view, we as a democratic nation think of democracy in a certain way. And we're so determined to make sure that democracy is held in Egypt, in Jordan, and they don't have the same definition of democracy that we do.
Well, we have to remember, Barbara, that I think that's a very good point. And in a sense, the first election isn't what makes a democracy. It's the second election, right? And so that's the big question for many of these countries. Take Egypt, for example, which is undergoing the first round of its parliamentary elections right now. The Islamist parties, the Muslim Brotherhood and more radical parties, are poised to win those elections. And then they will have responsibility to govern. And the question is, I think, really, when it comes time for the second election, will there be a second election? And will these parties be held accountable by the people for, say, unemployment, for inflation, for all those bread and butter concerns which people around the world have? And if we see these countries holding not just one election, but multiple elections, and if we see rights being enshrined in these countries and political institutions built in these countries, that's what makes a democracy. So you can't see democracy overnight, and one election won't make a democracy.
Yeah, well, I hope the pessimism is, I'm glad there's a little bit of optimism in here, because I'm frankly very nervous about the situation. First of all, I'm very worried about the security of Israel. They have to change their strategy somehow because of the border between Egypt and Syria. What do you think is going to happen there? Don't you think that they have to be concerned?
I think Israel is very concerned. I mean, in a sense, their main concern hasn't changed. Their main concern remains Iran and its nuclear weapons program. And in a sense, that's only deepened as well, because Iran is getting closer to a nuclear weapon. But they've had new concerns added now to their strategic sort of threat picture. That one of them, most prominently, is Egypt. Egypt was before a close ally of Israel's. Hosni Mubarak was perhaps the Arab leader, maybe besides the King of Jordan, who coordinated most closely with the Israelis. And now you have not only an uncertain political future for the Israeli-Egyptian alliance, you have chaos in the Sinai Peninsula. We just saw that the gas pipeline that goes to Israel from Egypt was attacked for the fourth or fifth time.
That's right.
It's essentially a Wild West in the Sinai. They also have to be concerned now with their border with Syria. We saw incursions earlier this year across the Golan Heights frontier. They also have to be concerned, frankly, about their border with Jordan, their longest border, which has always been presumed to be relatively stable. But now, in light of the Arab Spring, in light of the tumult which has really shaken the region, they can't take that for granted anymore. And so all of a sudden, many things which the Israelis had sort of counted on for stability in their region are now open questions, and they have to reassess.
Do you think that the peace treaties between Jordan and Egypt and Israel are at risk at this point?
Well, I think the Israel-Jordan peace treaty, the cooperation between those two states for now looks stable, because the King of Jordan isn't facing right now a serious threat, although I think the Israelis have to wonder if that will continue for the long term. The Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty was always sort of a cold peace that was created by that treaty. You know, really the peace between Israel and Egypt was not so much a peace between the societies, but between the kind of sort of political and security echelons, in a sense. And really, Israel depended on one or two interlocutors on the Egyptian side to maintain that peace. And so what we've seen now is that those interlocutors are gone, and no one has clearly stepped in to replace them. And so I think that treaty will remain, not put aside the treaty, that peace will remain in question until the situation in Egypt stabilizes. And we know, who are we going to talk to? Who are the Israelis going to talk to on security matters, on the most vital strategic matters?
Speaking of the vital strategic matters and who they're going to talk to, what is the present status of the peace opportunity between Israel and the Palestinians? Is there anything that's moving positively?
I think it's relatively frozen, Barbara, unfortunately. the fact is that not only is Israel consumed with other threats, which frankly they view as bigger threats than the Palestinian situation, the Palestinians themselves, remember, have lost major regional support. Hosni Mubarak, Bashar al-Assad even were supporters of the Palestinian Authority in many ways. They've lost funding. We see that during the Arab Spring, the Palestinians have seen less funding, not more, from states like Saudi Arabia and so forth. They have got to worry, for example, about Hamas and whether Hamas will take advantage of the Arab Spring. They worry also about Iran and what Iran might do in the context of the Arab Spring. And so the Palestinians themselves, I think, are also risk averse right now. Mahmoud Abbas, we've seen, has not shown an interest in negotiations with Israel.
Yeah.
He's decided he's going to try to, I think, bolster his domestic standing amongst Palestinians through moves like this UN gambit, which he took in September. Now, those aren't going to get him any closer to peace, but I don't think that's what's foremost in his mind right now. I think foremost in his mind is his own survival and the survival of the Palestinian Authority.
Now, do you think that, for instance, Netanyahu is a little bit hardline? Do you think that he would prefer to keep the status quo at this point in regard to the peace process?
Well, I think that for the Israelis, the status quo is not ideal, but I think it's acceptable right now. And this is a big disconnect between the U.S. and Israel.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
That's right. President Obama in his May 19th speech said the status quo is unsustainable. I think the Israeli view is quite different, that the status quo may not be the best. In fact, in the long term, isn't the status quo they want, but for now is better than a more chaotic alternative. And so I think that when Prime Minister Netanyahu looks at the region, he doesn't see this as an auspicious time to be making land concessions to the Palestinians and so forth. He in fact said this in a speech just a couple of days ago, that now is not the time to be making territorial concessions because they have no sense of whether the Palestinian Authority will make it through this turbulent period.
I think we move around a little bit, but Turkey was a very big ally. And Israel's relationship with Turkey is not at its best. And how do you see this whole thing playing out? I know that I think Turkey is becoming close to the United States because of the Iran situation. They're nervous. But I'm worried that Israel is losing friends.
Well, certainly the Turkish-Israeli relationship has dramatically changed over the past several years, really with the rise of this AKP government in Turkey since 2002, and Prime Minister Erdogan, who heads the AKP party. Before, obviously, Turkey and Israel were close military allies, in many senses political allies as well, and that really has fallen apart completely.
Yeah.
And this is really rooted in both domestic politics in Turkey as well as Turkey's vision of its foreign policy. The domestic politics, I think, are simple. Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, is in a sense a populist, and so there are few issues in Turkey where you can get more votes probably than bashing Israel. And so this has been a political winner for him,
That's
frankly.
exactly right.
But I think also the way that Turkey and the way that Prime Minister Erdogan view Turkey's role in the world and in the region is really as a leader in the Middle East, a leader in the Islamic and Middle Eastern world, essentially, and a bridge between the Middle East and, say, the West. And I think that his advisors, primarily Foreign Minister Davutoglu, who's his chief foreign policy advisor, think that they need to essentially cultivate better relations with Islamic countries, with Arab countries, and that means having perhaps poorer relations with Israel. Now, Turkey's vision of its foreign policy has really been challenged by the Arab Spring. Turkey was a close ally of Libya. They were a close ally of Syria. And of course, now the Libyan regime is gone. Muammar Gaddafi, their ally, has fallen. And now they've also had turned against the Assad regime, and now they have quite a confrontational, even hostile relationship with Syria.
Yeah.
And so I think it remains to be seen exactly where Turkey's foreign policy and policy towards the Middle East will shake out. But right now, the Turkish-Israeli relationship is not on a trajectory to improve, which I think, frankly, is to the detriment of both countries.
Yes. On that note, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with the remainder of the program right after this brief message.
The Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County makes so much possible every day.
Serving tens of thousands of kosher meals to seniors and families through food pantries, the Jewish Hunger Response, holiday meals, and on-site meal programs.
Operating the Jewish Community Assistance Network in 6 local communities to provide health, wellness, and social programs to more than 2,000 seniors.
But we need your help. Volunteer your time. Pledge your support. Make a difference. Thank you for your generous support.
Thank you! Thank you! Thank you!
Welcome back to Mosaic. Prior to the break, we were talking about Turkey. Turkey wants to be the power in the Middle East, we know that, and it's a very, very big concern in terms of establishing or reestablishing a relationship with Israel. Is there any way that this could happen?
Well, I think it's in the strategic interest of both Turkey and Israel to have a close relationship. In the past, Turkey's influence with the United States, with Europe, in part depended on the fact that it was a country which had good relations with states like Israel, which wasn't hostile towards other U.S. allies in the region. Of course, Turkey's a NATO member. And so, when the Turkish prime minister threatened Israel with its naval capacity earlier this year, it was a truly remarkable moment because Turkey is a NATO ally where the U.S. has missile defense sites, for example, where the United States has a base at Incirlik. And so there's a clear strategic rationale for the two countries to patch over their differences. But I think that right now, again, Turkey's domestic politics and its sort of vision of itself as a leader in the Middle East have prevented that from happening. And I don't know whether Prime Minister Erdogan, as long as he's in charge of Turkey, that this will ever happen.
Yeah. I read a paper that you wrote regarding Iran's position of trying to kill, the rumor that they tried to kill the Saudi ambassador to Washington. What was Iran trying to do?
Well, first of all, thank you for reading my paper, Barbara.
I do. You read a lot of very good papers. I've read them all.
But I think that, look, Iran has had a difficult time navigating this so-called Arab Spring. And their position has been challenged in places like the Gulf, for example. There was an uprising in Bahrain where the largely Shia population of Bahrain was rising up against the Sunni monarchy of Bahrain. And as we remember, the Saudis sent troops in to Bahrain, along with other Gulf countries, and successfully defended the Sunni monarchy against this uprising. Whereas Iran, which really sees itself as sort of the patron of Shia populations in the region, essentially was forced to stand by helpless and do nothing. And so I think that the Iranians were prompted in part by that to want to reassert themselves, to want to reinvigorate their role in the region. This is only kind of added on to the fact that they've been under a lot of pressure from the West for their nuclear program and for other things. And so I think this was an effort by the Iranians to sort of reassert themselves, but of course it went badly awry.
Yeah. Well, they tried to make a statement, and I think they messed it up. But seriously, what about China? China is having a love affair with Iran, quote unquote, from one of your other articles. How is this? Share how this ever took place, why it's taking place. It's based on economics, I'm sure, but nonetheless, I'd like you to describe it.
Sure. Well, it is based partly on economics, but it's not entirely economics. I mean, the economic rationale is certainly strong. China is a major energy importer, and Iran provides a steady source of not only oil to China, but also participation in the upstream part of the oil investments. In other words, investments in the oil fields, the refining activities, and so forth, which China wants to be involved in to secure its oil supplies. And China will only need more oil as its population grows and as its economy grows. And so that part of the relationship may well deepen as the years go by. Iran's also an important destination for Chinese arms sales. And of course, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, is very deeply involved in the arms industry in China. And so there's a sort of mixing of the arms industry and the Chinese government, which creates, again, another economic bond with Iran. But there's a strategic angle as well, Barbara, which is that the Chinese really see the United States as their big strategic rival in the world. not as an enemy necessarily, but as a rival for influence, for power in East Asia, certainly. And we tend to take the point of view that China is sort of a reluctant partner in a struggle against Iran. The Chinese view is totally different. They see Iran as a potential ally in this strategic rivalry against the United States. And so you look at the Chinese strategic literature written by generals and defense intellectuals and so forth, and they talk about doing things like establishing bases in Iran, for example, and using Iran really as a place to project Chinese power beyond East Asia.
What do you think, how do you think our government is handling the Iran and the situation, and how with sanctions and no mention whatsoever of any kind of military intervention?
That's right. You know, I think that the current administration came in really thinking that engagement, so-called engagement with Iran, would do the trick, that reaching out to the Iranians, that sort of, trying to dial down the temperature in the U.S.-Iranian bilateral relationship would cause the Iranians to sort of come to the negotiating table and be more reasonable in the way they approached the nuclear issue. Well, obviously that didn't pan out, and they found themselves back on this kind of sanctions track. And admittedly, the sanctions that have been imposed are really quite strong, and I think we need to acknowledge that this most recent action against the Iranian central bank was worth doing and hopefully will have an effect. But you're right that we haven't really put as much pressure on the Iranian regime as perhaps we could, including by making clear that the military threat remains very much on the table, that we're willing, if necessary, to use military action against Iran to prevent it from getting nuclear weapons. And I think that any such threat, to be credible, needs to be backed up by a greater display of military force in the Gulf. We don't do the kind of military exercises now that we used to do in the Persian Gulf.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And but I think it makes us look very weak. And I don't know what our position is going to be in the future. When you say that China would like to be the leader, and so would Turkey. Everybody is, in a sense, in competition in terms of the strength and the impact that we can make. But I don't know how it's going to play out. Do you have any idea?
Well, you're right. There's a clear sense in the region that the United States is either no longer able or no longer willing to play the kind of balancing role that we have, especially since, really during the Cold War and even after the Cold War, we were the kind of protector or sort of guarantor of stability in the region. And now people have the sense that, with this leading from behind business and with our reluctance to make firm statements one way or the other on what's happening in the region, that perhaps we're no longer interested in doing that. And yet no one else is going to step into that vacuum from outside the region. The Chinese really aren't there yet. The Russians are in a sense, withdrawing more to their own sphere of influence and not doing this sort of thing anymore. And so I think what you'll see is exactly what you described, Barbara, which are these medium-sized powers in the region, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, maybe Egypt, if Egypt gets back on track, vying against one another for regional preeminence. And that could result, frankly, in more interstate conflict in the Middle East, in more turbulence in the Middle East, and that could be quite harmful for our interests.
Very, very worrisome. I read somewhere that Jordan is getting very close to Saudi Arabia. They're establishing a very strong relationship, which gives Jordan, of course, a little bit of power behind it. I would assume that's the reason.
Well, that's right. Jordan has been getting closer to Saudi Arabia. In fact, Saudi Arabia extended the invitation to Jordan to join the Gulf Cooperation Council. Now, of course, Jordan is not on the Persian Gulf, and so this is a little bit strange perhaps, but it reflects how important the Jordanians are to the Gulf countries, to the Saudis in particular, and Jordan's need really for external support, not only military or kind of security support, but also economic support, because Saudi Arabia has been giving billions of dollars in aid to Jordan at a time when, for example, its aid to the Palestinians has not been increasing.
That's interesting. I was curious about why that's taking place.
Well, I think it's because the Saudis see a real strategic interest in maintaining the stability of Jordan. The king of Jordan is obviously someone whose worldview and whose interests are very aligned with the Saudis and frankly with the United States as well, and they worry about what might follow the king if there were instability in a place like Jordan, and of course Jordan is right on their border. With the Palestinians, I think they simply don't see the strategic interest for themselves, and that's what we see across the Middle East, is as much as these Arab countries talk about the Palestinian issue, they tend to act in their own strategic interests, and oftentimes that's quite different from the rhetoric that you'll hear.
You don't think that by keeping the Palestinian situation and creating the unrest is a benefit to all of these countries?
Well, many people say this, that in a sense this gives a distraction
Yes.
to populations in the region, something to blame their troubles on. I don't know. It's not clear. What is clear, though, is that given the fact that the United States and Europe provide more funding for the Palestinians than comes from the Middle East, that these countries simply don't see this as their number one priority. What they see as their number one priority are things like, obviously, their economies and the free flow of oil, and very much Iran and Iran's nuclear program.
Yeah.
And so when they go to talk to U.S. officials, typically Iran is at the top of the agenda, not the Palestinian issue.
Yeah. They talk also about that Iran has the bomb. They don't have the bomb. They're not near the bomb. They're a year from the bomb. What is the fact? Do you know?
Well, the best evidence we have, and that's really all we have is evidence. We can't know, and this is the kind of the uncertain nature of intelligence work, is that Iran has made a lot of progress towards a nuclear weapon, and frankly is getting closer and closer. So they have 4 to 5 nuclear weapons worth of low-enriched uranium.
Yes.
And all they need to do is to further enrich that uranium, and essentially then they've got the components for a nuclear weapon. And that could take 6 months, it could take 12 months. That part is a little uncertain, but it sure isn't a very long time from our perspective sitting here. And so it's very concerning.
They just had another explosion in one of their areas where the nuclear process was taking place.
That's right. There's been a series of explosions. This
is
latest
the
one,
second one, yeah.
This latest one is in a place called Esfahan, which is where they have a very critical component of their nuclear program called their uranium conversion facility.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, the people wonder about what are the sources of these explosions and so forth, and it makes the Iranian regime probably worry about its own vulnerabilities, and we want them to worry. I mean, you know, I think that one of the aims of our policy should be to make them worry that essentially if they continue down the path they're on, that there will be a cost, in terms of sanctions, in terms of a military strike perhaps, but that we won't let them simply proceed without any kind of cost.
Okay. Can you give me one positive note before we conclude this program?
Well, I think, Barbara, that we should look at the revolutions in places like Egypt and Libya and Syria, and we can't lose sight of the fact that a lot of what's motivating these revolutions is a desire for freedom and is a desire for human rights, and those are the same values that we have. And so that's not to say that everything will turn out well in those countries, but it is to say that, you know, we should be supporting the people who share our values, and we should help the good guys win in these places. And I think that with the right policies, that we can help these countries turn out in a positive way.
I hope you're right. Sounds good.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you for
Okay.
being with us. Thank you for being with us as well. Be with us again next week when we have another look into the Jewish world. Goodbye from Mosaic.